Thank you. I want to start out by pointing out something. Quite obviously, we're not going to be able to solve the assassination this evening. But as you have heard, history really does matter. I want you to think of what we're going to be talking about tonight as a legacy for your grandchildren and my grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, because they will not have the opportunity we're going to have tonight, and that is to speak and to hear directly from people who were eyewitnesses and who were medical experts with regard to, quite clearly, the most controversial event that I think I can remember in my lifetime. A quick story about me. My father was in the military, so where I lived, the assassination happened at night. We lived just outside Madrid, Spain. My neighbor came hammering on our door, screaming. My mother answered the door, asked what happened. She said that the neighbor, Mrs. Attaway, said that President Kennedy has been assassinated. My mother started crying. The neighbor started crying. I remember looking out the window. Any of you have were in the military at that time, you might remember this. I remember looking out the window at that time. I was in the 4th grade. And seeing all these grown men run to their jobs in their Air Force uniforms in the nighttime. So you knew that it was something serious. For those of you who don't know, for a little while we thought the Russians did this. And those of you who think that that was not serious, it was serious. Very serious. So tonight what we're going to try to do is provide people who actually were eyewitnesses to this entire event, this situation, to the assistance of the president after he was shot. We're going to provide no filter from a journalist, no filter from history. That's why I have here a list of questions from the audience. If you haven't had a chance to give us your questions yet, you'll see people coming through. When I do these programs, I like to give the audience questions as much time as possible. You hear enough from journalists. They yak a lot. So this is an opportunity to answer the kinds of questions I think that you may have. With that, please join me in welcoming, first of all, Dr. Ronald C. Jones, Chairman of the Department of Surgery, Baylor University Medical Center. Dr. Jones was the Chief Surgery Resident at Parkland Memorial Hospital's emergency room on November 22nd, 1963. He was among the team of doctors that worked on the resuscitation of President Kennedy in Trauma Room 1. And then less than 48 hours later, he was part of the surgical team that treated Lee Harvey Oswald. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ronald Jones. Dr. Robert Mcclellan. Dr. Mcclellan is an instructor in surgery at Parkland Memorial Hospital in 1963. He is now a professor emeritus of surgery at UT Southwestern Medical Center. He participated in the treatment of President Kennedy in Trauma Room 1, assisted in the surgery of Governor John Connally, and less than 2 days later, the treatment of Lee Harvey Oswald. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause, please, for Dr. Robert Mcclellan. Doctor, I want to start this off, first of all, for our audience who may not live here. Give us a sense of what Dallas and the hospital was like in the early 1960s.
Well, Parkland Hospital, that was the third Parkland Hospital. The first one was in the late 1800s, burned. Second one was on Maple Avenue, and the third was the current Parkland Hospital on Harry Hines, and it had not been completed. It was only 7 stories rather than the 10 stories that it is now, and it had opened in 1956, so it was a relatively new hospital, county hospital for the indigent or low-income patients for Dallas County. And there was some segregation going on in that hospital at the time, as there was throughout the country.
Dr. Mcclellan, your thoughts about Dallas and Parkland at the time?
Right. Well, one of the things that has struck in my mind is how Dallas has changed in general, just from, say, the political standpoint. At that time, in the early 1960s and late 50s, there was probably a much less balanced political climate here. Perhaps a great deal toward the right side. In fact, I remember seeing a publication in one of the two papers, I forget which one, whether it was the Times-Herald or the Dallas News. Somebody had bought a full-page ad the day before President Kennedy came with President Kennedy's picture on it and said, "Wanted for treason." So that was some of the climate that existed here at that time. And that caused a great deal of kind of concern and worry, in fact, when President Kennedy came to Dallas.
Let's go through this now of the day itself. For those of you who were not born at the time, it was on a Friday. It was a very nice day. Tell me what happened, how your day, Dr. Jones, tell me how your day began and how you were first notified.
Okay, I had just finished a vascular procedure, an abdominal aortic vascular procedure, and that was concluded about 11:30, having started about 8 or 8:30. And we went down to the cafeteria to have lunch, along with Dr. Perry and I did, who was my staff. And the operator began to page Dr. Tom Shire Stat. He was chief of surgery, Dr. Tom Shire Stat. That means respond immediately. And then other physicians were paged Stat. And I knew he was not even in town, and so I went up to the telephone on the wall in the cafeteria and I called the operator and I said, "Why are you paging everyone's Stat?" And she said, "Dr. Jones, the president's been shot and they're bringing him to the emergency room and they need doctors right away." And that gave you a tremendous flush, adrenaline rush feeling. And I turned around and the chief of anesthesia and the OR supervisor were right behind me, and I told them what had happened. I said, "You're not going to believe this, but the president's been shot." And Dr. Jenkins said, "I'll go upstairs and get an anesthesia machine." And Audrey Bell said, "I'll get the operating room ready." And so Dr. Perry and I, along with Dr. Red Duke, who was a fourth-year resident, went out the back of the cafeteria, ran down the hall, down the steps, into the front of the emergency room, and ran back into trauma room 1, and that's where the president was, and Mrs. Kennedy was standing just inside the room on the left, and the president was on the cart. And we saw this small wound in the neck and a large wound in the back of the head.
Dr. Mcclellan, how about you? Where were you when you first were notified?
I was in the operating room at Parkland, on the second floor of Parkland, and I was showing a movie about how to repair a hiatus hernia to several of the senior surgery residents. And in the midst of that, I heard a little tap on the conference room door. And so I went to the door and looked out, and one of our senior surgery residents was standing there, Dr. Crenshaw. And he said, "Dr. Mack, would you step outside? I needed to tell you something." And so I went in, shut off the projector, and stepped back outside. And he said, "They've just called from the emergency room and said they're bringing President Kennedy in from his motorcade downtown where he's been shot. And they want all the surgery faculty to come down to the emergency room immediately." So Dr. Crenshaw and I got into the elevator there in the operating room and rode 2 floors down to the emergency room that was just below the operating room. And as we were riding down, we were talking to one another and saying hopefully that, well, many times we hear about some bad things being brought into the emergency room, but it turns out that it's really not that bad. With that, the door to the elevator came opened out into the emergency room, and I saw immediately a huge crowd of people, shoulder to shoulder, men in business suits standing there in the emergency room, filling it up. And I thought I'd never seen anything like this before. And just as I stood there and took that in, the crowd spontaneously parted, made a little corridor down to the emergency operating rooms just off of the central part of the emergency room. And there, sitting outside trauma room 1 on a folding chair, was Mrs. Kennedy in her bloody clothing. So I knew immediately then that this was just what they said it was.
You gentlemen may not be able to see it, but can everybody see the pictures that we have displayed for you now? That is trauma room 1. Is that correct?
That's right.
Most of us who are not familiar with medicine, we probably have a different vision of what might have been a trauma room, but that was an up-to-date trauma room for 1963. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And if you look at this room, I don't know if I can find the pointer or not. I had a pointer here. You can see that this room, he was on a cart, and I'm standing about right here, and you can see that that's no more than 6 feet to this cabinet. And by the time I needed the chest trays and the cut-down trays to start an IV, I could not get to that
There were so many people.
There were so
in the
many
room.
people there.
Did you see the picture that was before this? The staff members. A lot of people may be under the impression that maybe only 3 or 4 people were in that room in terms of medical staff. These are members of who worked on the president at the time or worked on the staff, all these individuals?
No, these were the residents and some of the staff taken a few months later. And Dr. Perry, who worked on the president, was sort of considered the primary surgeon, is here and deceased. Dr. Tom Shires there, deceased. And Dr. Baxter, who was also there, deceased. And Dr. Crenshaw, who you mentioned, deceased. Dr. Carrico, who was a second-year resident, deceased. And there's some others up there. I think Phil Williams was in the front row. He was in the area.
This is a room that is what, Dr. McClellan, 15 feet square?
Probably approximately that. Not much bigger than that.
Size of a
very small
master
room.
bedroom closet or something?
Well, a little bit larger than that. Unless
But
you've got a big closet.
not very large
Not
at
very
all.
big, not very big. Not a room.
Depends on where you live. Maybe it is that size.
Yeah. You describe for us, if you can, when you first walk in the room. Now, you've mentioned you saw Mrs. Kennedy sitting on a folding chair, Dr. McClellan. Let's go on from there to tell us specifically what you saw from that period forward.
Well, I walked by Mrs. Kennedy and pushed the door to Trauma Room 1 open, and there were several other people, Dr. Perry, Dr. Jones, Dr. Carrico were in there before me, and they were just beginning to work on the president. Dr. Perry was assuming the role of the primary surgeon, and as I walked by on the left side of the gurney the president was lying on, Dr. Perry leaned across and handed me a surgical retractor and said, "Bob, would you go stand at the head of the cart and lean over and put this retractor in the wound in his neck where we're going to explore and do a tracheostomy."
Can you explain for those of us that have missed what a retractor is?
Well, a retractor is a little metal surgical instrument, very simple little blade that has a little hook on the end of it, and you can put that in the edge of an incision and pull it open so the operating surgeon can see better down into the wound. So that put me at the head of the gurney, leaning over the president's head and looking down from about 18 inches into his head wound, in the back of his wound. So I had probably the best view of that massive wound in the back of his head from that position where I was helping Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter do the tracheostomy and the exploration of this wound.
Now, Dr. Perry, Dr. Carrico, the initial concern was this wound here.
Right.
Based upon what I've heard you say, there wasn't a doctor in the room who was probably closer to that massive head wound than you.
No. In fact, when I went and stood in that position, the first thing that kind of exclaimed out of my mouth was, I said, "My God, have you seen the back of his head? It's gone." And Dr. Carrico said, "No, we just got here just ahead of you, and we haven't had time to look at anything except this wound in his neck." And I said, "Well, the back of his brain, the back half of his brain is gone." And as I stood there, just as I said that, the right half of the cerebellum, the back part of the brain, fell out of that massive wound in the back of his head onto the cart. So this was obvious that this was a fatal injury to the brain.
Dr. Jones, where were you at the time? What did you see at the time?
Position-wise, the president flat on the table, arms out, Dr. Perry's above him near the shoulder. I'm right here. And so I couldn't see over the back of the head nearly as well, but I did get one of the few people that saw the wound right here in the middle of his neck. And I think all of us that first day thought that was an entrance wound. And our assumption was for the first 24 hours that was an entrance wound. This was an exit wound. Subsequently, that was proven wrong. When we didn't, once he was decided that he was dead, we didn't turn him over. And at autopsy, it was found that he had been shot in the back as well. Since Dr. Perry had made the incision here, they didn't, in Bethesda, recognize this wound. And so they saw a wound back here and a wound up here, and they didn't find any bullet, and they didn't find an exit area. So once they called us the next morning and found out about that, they said, okay, he's been shot back here, and this is an exit wound, not an entrance wound.
Okay. I though have some real questions about the wounds themselves. Ones that I'm not sure you've been asked before. Had he not been shot in the head, would he have been able to survive the other wound? Because I've heard you say before, both of you say, the head wound was not survivable, even today. Is that correct?
That's right.
Correct.
That's correct. Now, what about the other wound?
I think that was survivable. That was a wound. If it did, whichever direction it came, from the front to the back or the back to the front, it would have skimmed across the neck and out next to the major blood vessels. That was one concern we had, not only in making the tracheostomy, but was the major blood vessel to the brain, the carotid artery, injured. It was not, but that could have been injured, but it was not injured. So this wound here, from the front to the back or the back to the front, was basically a soft tissue injury that would have been readily survivable.
Okay.
But it did injure his windpipe.
Did injure
his windpipe.
Yeah, but that would not have been any kind of fatal injury.
Now we have come to the point that I find most fascinating, because we all have memories. And in 50 years' time, those memories sometimes are divergent. And the two of you have different memories of the wounds you saw. I want you, for us, to describe in your own words, nothing from me or anybody else, what you saw in terms of the wound injuries. Dr. Mcclellan, I'm going to start with you, because I know that you had some, in hearing what you're saying, you had some questions about the wounds and what has been described as a wound.
Right, and that's based mainly on two things. First of all, what I saw in the emergency room, and then a number of years later, when I first had the opportunity to see the Zapruder film and see several, showings of it, that altered what I came to think about the nature of the wounds and whether there was more than one shooter or simply one shooter. And what I saw in the Zapruder film was, as I'm sure many people have seen this film, as he's coming off of Houston Street onto Elm Street, heading toward the triple underpass, he's sitting next to Mrs. Kennedy, and they both look fine. Then just as they make that turn, as I'm sure everybody recollects, President Kennedy's hands go up to his neck. And so something has clearly happened at that time. And then the motorcade continues moving slowly down toward the triple underpass on Elm Street and disappears behind a large sign that was present at that time, is not there now, for a few moments. And then it proceeds out from behind that sign, and as the motorcade comes out from behind the sign, you see President Kennedy still has his hands up to his neck, and Mrs. Kennedy now has realized something has happened, and she's leaning over to him as if to say, what's wrong? And just as she does that, President Kennedy's head literally explodes, and he's thrown violently backward and to the left. And so that made me see that, as I saw that in several, run-throughs, that this looked like he was hit from one direction, from behind or above, with that first shot, and then that a shot came from in front and threw him violently backward and to the left. And that fit with what I saw, that massive wound low not high, but low in the back of his head.
Yeah, let me stop you right there, because everybody, you can see what we're showing you. I should point out to you our drawings, so we're not going to show you the actual photographs, but it's this drawing that Dr. Mcclellan believes is inconsistent with his conclusions. This one shows a bullet coming from upper back down to the front.
Right.
That's inconsistent with your conclusions.
That's not consistent with what I saw, no.
Okay.
But, well, I don't think that drawing's consistent with what the autopsy showed either. They show a small wound here and then a large wound here. If you look at the Zapruder film, now let's take the opposite side interpretation of that. The head does go back, and so people said, well, if the head goes back, he must have been shot from the front. John Latimer, who's a urologist in New York, did a lot of studies. He first did it with watermelons, and he shot, and invariably the watermelon went back into the left. There was some criticism over that, so he took skulls and filled it with material like brain, and each time, consistently, the brain went forward, the fragments went up, and there were 2 fragments found in the windshield of the limo, and the skulls always fell back. Now, they weren't attached to the body, but nevertheless, they always fell back, even though they had been shot from the back. And these studies were done at the same angle in a tall building, 265 feet, which there's 3 films, not just the Zapruder, that show this. And that's how they determined that he was shot 265 feet away. And all that was consistent with being shot from behind.
I should tell you that Dr. Jones, best way for me to say it is, you believe the Warren Commission's conclusion is more reliable than Dr. McClellan's.
There's other evidence that, as far as this entrance wound and exit wound, because of the fibers that the forensic pathologist, now you got to believe the pathologist, Commander Hume was 38 years old when he was doing this, and the fibers in the back go in, and the fibers in the shirt where it exits in the tie go out. So that's the point that they make, that this must be an entrance and an exit. If you just looked at this, it looks like an entrance wound. We described it as a quarter of an inch. There's 2.5 centimeters in an inch. Quarter of it, 6.5, that's the size of the missile. So it's consistent with the missile, no question about that. But it could be an entrance or an exit, but it's the forensic pathologist interpretation that makes that determination that it's an exit wound. If you look at that Zapruder film, you see this flap of skull come out right here. And I think it's a little lower than what this film shows.
Yeah, everybody get a shot of that. It's a little bit lower than that. If you take a look at this is the Zapruder film that you're talking about, right?
Correct.
And the
autopsy too.
And the autopsy too. Mm-hmm. But Dr. Mcclellan, again, your concerns are with that whole theory of even a single gunman. You think that, in point of fact, this may have been also done by someone who was shooting from the grassy knoll.
I think that's at least possible. And here again, there's no question that, as Dr. Jones says, that whether this was an entrance or an exit, this was a separate wound. And I think that there was a second bullet fired from the grassy knoll that blew out the back of his head. I don't think this bullet that came through here had anything to do with making that massive wound in the back of his skull. And that was low enough where I could see down into it and see the back part of the cranial cavity, and then when the cerebellum fell out, I could see even farther back into the skull. So this was a wound way back in the back of the skull, which is more consistent with a wound coming from the front and blowing out the back, the lower part of the back of the skull. Now, I'm sometimes asked, well, did you see an entrance wound that would be consistent with that big wound? And I have to say, no, I did not. And all I can speculate there, and I want to emphasize that's all I'm doing is speculating, that the wound that maybe came in from the front, from maybe the grassy knoll, and blew out the back of his head was perhaps hidden within the hairline. And we didn't spend any time after he was pronounced dead looking at his head. His head was covered with blood, and the thick hair on his head very readily could have covered up a wound that entered about here and blew out the back of his head. That's my speculation. I emphasize that that's speculation.
What would, going to one of the questions from the audience, what, other than time, would be a reason for the divergence of opinions? Is it just, there's just not enough evidence to say anything conclusively? Because I think most of us have the impression that based upon what we see in the Warren report, and other things, is that, it's pretty conclusive. But I'm kind of hearing from both of you, well, medically, I don't know.
Well, of course, we know
no.
that in 1976 to 79, because of all the speculation about this, and they say 75 to 80% of the American public believed there was a second gunman or a conspiracy rather than one gunman, the House Special Select Assassinations Committee was set up and studied all of this again from 1976 to 1979. And they concluded after that in all probability, and I think that's the way the conclusion was stated, in all probability there was a conspiracy, there was more than one gunman. And they also said, which kind of made everybody wonder about that, however, we are not at liberty to produce all of the findings until 50 years from now, until 2029. I still don't understand that.
I was going to ask you, Dr. Jones, does that frustrate you? The two of you, when I think about all the people who claim to be witnesses to some part of this 48-hour event, from the death of the president to the death of Lee Harvey Oswald, the two of the individuals who would have more education, more experience with gunshot wounds than anybody else are the two of you. And yet you don't seem to have had enough access to the materials. Does that seem proper to you?
Well,
I know you mentioned to me, let me give you an example.
Okay.
You mentioned to me, I think it was Assassination Review Board. And you went hoping to see, X-rays and some other things. Did you get to see them?
Well, Dr. Mcclellan was there too, along with Dr. Baxter and Dr. Perry and Dr. Paul Peters. And they said that they were going to bring us some X-rays and some pictures, photos, and see what our opinion was of what had been described in the autopsy and what pictures they had there. So we met over at the medical schools, UT Southwestern. They showed up. They said, well, we couldn't bring any of that material for security reasons. You know, we're 30, 40 years later, and I don't know what the security reasons were. They just didn't bring them for one reason or another. So we haven't seen that, and all we have to go on is the Warren report and the pathology report. We don't have evidence of another shooter that we can put our hands on. I know you talked to the mute, Mr. Hoffman. I've heard his presentation. He claims that he saw somebody from the overpass shoot from the overpass. When Arlen Specter, who came down here 6 months after the assassination, represented the Warren Commission, was the junior counsel. He was the one that quizzed me. After it was over with, he came out in the hall at Parkland, and because he was quizzing me about the entrance wound. I initially, no question about it, thought it was an entrance wound. He said, I want to tell you, we have people who will testify they saw him shot from the overpass, but we do not believe they're credible witnesses, and I don't want you saying anything about it.
Arlen Specter told you that?
Yes.
Do you not think that that's a suggestion of how to conduct your testimony? trying to be as...
This was after the testimony. I'd already told him what I thought.
Yeah.
And, you know, he quizzed me with such questions as, well, Dr. Jones, have you ever seen a individual shot from 265 feet with a missile going X number of miles per hour, entering the back and exiting the front of the neck with a rifle that he described? Well, you know, that's a specific thing. Probably you haven't. So that tells you, no, I really haven't. But it's been a lot of gunshot wounds. For instance, I reviewed our experience the next year at Parkland. We saw 1,200 plus gunshot wounds, 515 of which were admitted to the hospital. So we were seeing 3 gunshot wounds a day on average. So we saw a lot of gunshot wounds.
Dr. Mcclellan, and I guess this for you too, Dr. Jones, had you ever seen damage to a body from a gunshot wound like you saw that day?
Well, I've seen some pretty bad damage done, yes. In fact, even worse than that. But I have to defer to Dr. Jones. He's much more expert in seeing and managing gunshot wounds than I am. Although all of us at Parkland saw quite a bit of that, but Dr. Jones, I think, was our expert, if you will, then and still is.
Well, we've seen, most of the gunshot wounds that we see are pistols. Yeah. Now you're seeing AK-45s and all types of rapid fire. But back then we were seeing 22s, 32s, 38, 45 caliber pistols and shotgun injuries, occasional rifle injuries. And a rifle injury, if you get a rifle injury to the arm, it just literally destroys it, the bone, the soft tissue, and everything. So it does massive destruction. Occasionally we saw some small caliber missiles. I remember one at the state fair, shot right here and came out there, and the kid, slow recovery, but he made a recovery and came back to full function. So, but not with a rifle like that you hit the brain.
One of your colleagues, Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who's no longer with us, wrote a book about his experiences with regard to the assassination. Your thoughts about the book, and also he mentioned a rather unusual phone call that he got, a suggestion of how he should conduct his testimony from there on out. Any of you ever got a strange phone call? Go ahead.
Doctor sitting right there in front of me, I think, has some knowledge of that, don't you? Yeah. So I think that phone call, which came from the White House, apparently did come through.
Talk to us a little bit, if you can, about what you know of that phone call.
All I know is circumstantial. I know nothing directly but what I was told. And what I was told, and again, by my good friend sitting here in front of me, who was sitting there in the nurse's station listening to the phone, that someone called from the White House as Lee Harvey Oswald was on the table, wanting to find out what condition he was in. That's all just hearsay, really, for me, but I think that's probably did occur.
Okay. Anybody ever try to coax your testimony in either way? Your memory, trying to change your memory, the facts you wrote down? Because right after this happened, I believe you were both asked by the Secret Service to write out what occurred.
Right.
Which you did.
That's
Anybody ever ask you to alter that in any way, any form, any fashion?
No.
It was stamped. What was interesting, we wrote it out and hand scribbled it out on a piece of paper, and then years later I saw it stamped top secret, and it had been in the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission did over 25,000 interviews and had over 25,000 pages. There was 25,000 just from the FBI, and there was another 4,600 pages produced from the Secret Service. So they had 30,000 pages of information. Nobody's able to go through all of that information. Most of the interviews were done outside. I think there were only 90 some odd people that actually appeared before the Warren Commission.
How do they treat the two of you? The Warren Commission.
Well, they interviewed me at Parkland in the administrator's office, and in fact, I was interviewed by Arlen Specter, who was at that time just a junior lawyer. We were both the same age, and we had a very nice interview there, and I told him what my impressions were at that time, and he wrote them down. And it's interesting, too, that written report that they had us do right after we came upstairs from having attended the president, if you get the New York Times condensed version of the Warren report, those written reports are reproduced in there. My written report is just in my handwriting, is in that. So there's nothing secret about that.
Dr. Jones, you feel that the Warren Commission got your fair and complete and accurate information about what you saw the day of the assassination?
Yeah, I think they questioned a lot about what I thought was the entrance wound, and tried to convince me that it was an exit wound, and said that if a bullet does not fragment, does not tumble, does not strike bone, that the exit wound can be the same size as the entrance wound. The pristine bullet really was not pristine. It was pristine in the nose, but the back of the cartridge was damaged, and so it was not pristine.
Okay. Dr. Mcclellan, I know that you have smiled when asked whether or not you supported the magic bullet theory.
No, I don't really, and there's a lot of question, not just from me, but from many people about that.
Can you explain your concerns about it?
Well, I think that a bullet made all of those turns, going through the president and then out, and then going into Governor Connolly and through his chest and out into his arm and then into his thigh. That's a pretty athletic kind of bullet, I think, to do that. Yeah.
Dr. Jones?
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things that the Warren Commission, our inspector is the one that came up with the single bullet theory, the magic bullet theory, is that bullet goes in here, out here, tumbles, and because it's tumbling, and perhaps the side of the missile or the back side of the missile hits the rib cage here, then it causes this massive sucking chest wound in his chest, just below the nipple line, fifth rib, and comes on down, still tumbling, fractures his wrist, and then a fragment goes into the thigh. Now, Connolly is in the limo with a suit on. He's taken out of the limo, put on a stretcher, brought into trauma room 2. Clothes are taken off, and a gown's put on. Sheets are put on him. He's taken on the stretcher up to the operating room, moved to the OR table. Sheets are taken off, folded. The table comes back down to the ER, and somebody finds a missile on the table. And nobody saw that, and had that, well, it either had to be in his clothes that fell off, or it had to just be hanging in the skin and fell off, but nobody saw that during that entire transport or examination. That's difficult to believe. I'm not saying it can't happen, but that's part of the magic bullet theory.
It was also found on a stretcher that was completely pristine with its sheet. There were no blood or anything on it, just this bullet lying there with no blood stains or anything.
What do let me see what we have up here. This is a picture right now that you're taking a look at, I believe.
That's the Assassination Review Board.
That's the Assassination Review Board that you heard Dr. Jones talk about earlier. This is when you arrived hoping to see some X-rays, perhaps some other photographic information, some other photographs that might help to elucidate help your memory with regard to what you saw that day. Didn't see anything because it was.
I don't believe we were given anything. We were asked some questions, and they took that testimony, but I don't think we saw anything. It's probably that they brought.
Have you ever been able to see any of the photographs, anything like that?
Did you go to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We saw nothing there anymore. In fact, it was really, really strange, kind of dramatic. We went to the National Archives, and you went.
I didn't go. Well, the Boston Globe called me, and I thought it was sort of a put-up that they were doing. In retrospect, wish I'd gone, but didn't.
Well, they took 5 of us, went up there, as I recall, and each one of us, individually, we stood out in the anteroom of the entrance of the National Archives, the 5 of us, and then they called us each separately, and we were very dramatic. It was kind of ridiculous, really. Each one of us were, as we were called to come back to the room where we were to look at this material, a soldier in uniform carrying a rifle over his arm escorted us marched us, with a rifle next to us, and people were standing around staring, at what was this going on, and took us down to the room, and then took us into another little anteroom, and we waited there for a minute, and then they called us inside this other room, and there was a man sitting behind a desk on a dais, kind of like this. And we were asked then to come up on the dais and sit down, and he showed us some pictures, handed us some 8x10 glossies of the postmortem, and said, "Is this what it looked like when you saw this in Dallas?" And I think each of us, as we compared notes later, the 5 of us who went through that, said, "Yes, that's what we saw. Thank you," they said, and that was it. And we flew back home to Dallas. So that was kind of odd, but it was really over dramatically done, I think.
I want to go back a little bit. Dr. Jones, in trauma room 1, if I remember correctly, you were the person who had to cut some of President Kennedy's clothes away in order to begin his treatment. You came across in removing some of his clothing. You came across an ace bandage, which was used to hold in place, I believe, a back brace. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What's some of the? I'm just curious about what some of the treatment that took place with regard to the president when he first came in. You mentioned a cut down, and those of us who are not in medicine, perhaps you could.
Well, a cut down is making an incision somewhere to isolate a vein and make an incision in that vein and put a catheter in it and secure it and then connect that to an IV catheter and the bottle is hanging. So that's what a cut down is. The ace bandage was wrapped around the abdomen and down the thigh to hold the back brace in. Now, what I thought you were going to get into was medication that might have been given. And when we started the cut down, Dr. Carrico had remembered that perhaps that President Kennedy had Addison's disease, which was a deficiency in the adrenal gland and might have been on steroids or had been on steroids in the past. And when that happens and you have a traumatic insult, your adrenal gland may not function properly and you can eventually die from that. So he gave him 300 milligrams of hydrocortisone IV. That was one of the questions our inspector asked me. He said, "You gave him 300 milligrams of hydrocortisone. Did you ask his doctor? Did you ask Ms. Kennedy if he had Addison's disease?" "No." "So you just administered it without any information except what you had read in a newspaper or magazine," which was what Dr. Carrico had done. He said, "What if you had given too much? What would happen if you'd given too much?" And I said, "Nothing would have happened. It wouldn't have made any difference. If he needed it, he could have utilized it. If he didn't, it would have been all right." But that was the kind of questioning I got. Some pretty strict questions.
Mm-hmm.
More questions from the audience. Did either of you witness the removal of President Kennedy's body from Parkland, and what were your recollections of that?
I did not. I know the issue about him being moved, and Dr. Earl Rose, who was the forensic pathologist, wanted to do the autopsy in Dallas because the rule was if you were shot in Dallas and killed, you were autopsied in Dallas County. And the Secret Service and FBI said, "Get out of the way," and took him, despite what Dr. Rose was saying, and took him out. I did not see him removed, and according to the autopsy people, they said he was not placed in a bag, although we've heard that he was placed in a bag, but I didn't see it.
I understand that one of the two of you was in the room. They had pushed the cart to the side. You were kind of against the wall in between the cart, and Mrs. Kennedy came in. I think I read that somewhere. Is that correct? Can you recall that story?
Yeah, that was Dr. Baxter and I were still in the room after the president was pronounced dead, and that crowded room when the president was pronounced dead emptied rapidly. And in doing that, the cart the president was lying on was pushed over against the wall. And where Dr. Baxter and I happened to be standing at that time, And as the crowd pushed out and pushed the cart against the wall, we were trapped between the cart and the wall. So we had to just stand there as the rest of the people left. And then after the entire room emptied, we began to push the cart away so we could walk around the head of it and leave Trauma Room 1 ourselves. But before we could do that, the door to Trauma Room 1 came open and a priest came in. And in order to get out of the room, we would have had to kind of push him out of the way. So again, Dr. Baxter and I simply froze against the wall and found ourselves in a position inappropriately where we had to observe the president's last rites. So the priest came over, Father Huber, we found out was his name later, and he came over, and I remember the first thing he said in administering the last rites. He said, "If thou livest," down close to the president's left ear, and then I couldn't hear him say anything else. And he completed that briefly and was getting ready to leave himself when the door came open again to Trauma Room 1 and Mrs. Kennedy came in. And she came over directly across from where Dr. Baxter and I were standing and next to Father Huber, and she spoke in such a soft voice that I couldn't hear what she said, but from the context of Father Huber's answer, I knew that she had asked Father Huber if he had received last rites. And so Father Huber said to her clearly, and I heard him say this, he said, "Yes, I've given him conditional absolution." And so Mrs. Kennedy grimaced when she heard that word conditional. I mean, she didn't say anything. She stood there. She was very self-contained, stood there for a moment and exchanged a ring from her finger to the president's finger and a ring from his finger to her finger, and stood there for another moment, and then slowly walked down to the end of the gurney, the cart the president was lying on, and his bare right foot was sticking out from underneath the sheet, and she leaned over and kissed his right foot, and then walked out of Trauma Room 1, and that's the last we saw of her, and then Dr. Baxter and I left. So that was the final thing that went on in Trauma Room 1.
There's a question from the audience. Thank you. There's a question from the audience for Dr. Mcclellan. I believe the doctor's statement that the throat wound was an entry wound, but where did this bullet go?
I'll defer to you on that, Dr. Jones.
Well, initially we thought it was an entrance wound because we did not know he had been shot in the back. But when we found out he'd been shot in the back, then it could be, and if he was going to shot from the back, that this could be an exit wound. Remember when they looked upstairs in the 6th floor depository, they found 3 cartridges up there. So there are at least 3 shots fired from the 6th floor. So we know 2 of them, at least he was shot twice, and there were 3 cartridges found. So that came from the 6th floor. The rifle was found on the 6th floor. The wrapping that the rifle was brought in was found on the 6th floor.
I want to make sure I get through as many as I can. There's a question here, and I don't know if either of you can answer this. Is it true that all of the Trauma Room 1 walls are in storage in Kansas City per the Kennedys' request?
I don't know if it's the Kennedy's request, but I understand they're stored in Kansas City.
Well, that's my understanding, too, that they're in storage. I think I saw some story that said that they'd been destroyed, actually, but that they're no longer at Parkland.
They're no longer at Parkland, and I don't think they're open to the public. I did not know they'd been destroyed.
Do the two of you have some concerns about this being 50 years and there still being so much secrecy with regard to so much evidence, so much material in this assassination? Do you have some concern about that?
Well, I have concern, for instance, that House Special Select Committee that concluded that there probably was a conspiracy, and yet they haven't released the information leading to that conclusion until 2029. Why is that? I don't understand that.
I'm just concerned it's been 50 years and I'm still alive.
There's one for both of you. Has your affiliation with the Kennedy assassination been a godsend or a curse in your life? And also, has it made you a better physician?
I don't think it's had any particular effect one way or the other in that regard. I'm not saying I discount the importance of it. I'm just saying that that was what I do. What I did that day, that was what I was trained to do, and what I did the best way I could, as did all of us. And I don't think that, I mean, it sounds like, oh, this is some great dramatic event, which it certainly was. I'm not discounting that at all. But it didn't really affect my own personal life or its outcome. And I think that's true probably of all of us.
Yeah. It hadn't really affected people. The only way it's affected us is having been there in that presence and people wanting more information and just want to hear that one more time. Everybody's interested in hearing that story that you're able to tell them.
Here's an interesting, sorry for my voice, an interesting question. In comparison to the wound of President Lincoln, I realize you weren't there. What would you think about that? President Kennedy's injuries were clearly not survivable.
Right.
I think the questioner wants to know, why is it that President Lincoln was able to linger for some period of time and not President Kennedy?
Well, he was shot with a small pistol, as I recall, and it was a smaller hole, and they kept probing it, and he kept bleeding, but it was a different caliber. He was not shot with a high-powered rifle.
I've got some questions here that also have to do with Lee Harvey Oswald, and this question is directed to both of you. If the bullet fired by Ruby traveled front to back instead of left to right, could Oswald's life have been saved so he would have gone to trial?
I think that's quite true. That he, unfortunately, as probably any of us would, when he saw someone coming at him with a pistol, tried to avoid being shot. So he turned and presented his left side to the weapon, and instead of going from front to back, which it might have if, say, he hadn't seen the pistol, very likely could have caused significant injuries, but not fatal injuries. But as it was, when he turned, the bullet went in on the left side and went across the back of his abdomen and injured both of the two main blood vessels in the body, the vena cava and the aorta. And usually you bleed out immediately when that occurs, but as luck would have it, he didn't. And even that might have been salvageable, but usually not. So what happened to him and the way he moved cost him his life, I think. And we were able, though, to get down to the wound almost. Dr. Shires was doing the operating. Dr. Jones and I were helping. And Dr. Perry was there also. And just as we got down, just as Dr. Shires got down near where he might get clamps on those two major injuries, then Oswald, who had suffered a great deal of shock and his heart had been injured, he arrested. And Dr. Perry and I dropped out of surgery, opened his chest and massaged his heart for some time. And initially we thought cardiac activity would come back, but then finally it got flabbier and flabbier until it was apparent the heart would not recover.
I reviewed our patients that had had a combined aorta and vena cava injury, went back as far as I could find the records. After that, we had never saved a patient that had that combined injury. And even today, didn't operate on it, I've seen two at Baylor in the last year, and one of them lived many, many days, but they ultimately died. He had, in addition to that, he had the diaphragm, the lung, the liver, the pancreas injury, and the right kidney. So he had all those injuries in addition to those major vessel injuries.
All from one bullet, because I heard you say a heart injury. I thought that I heard that.
No, injury from the shock.
A shock injury.
Not a bullet
shock
wound
injury.
in the heart. No.
Okay. So, but all that injury that you talk about from one bullet.
Yeah, and going across the back part of the abdomen like that.
Sort of what you'd do with what we call a shish kebab. He just got everything.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? Interesting. Was it difficult for you understanding what had happened at the beginning of this 48-hour period with the death of President Kennedy? Was it difficult for you to now work on his accused assassin?
That's a question that comes up a lot, and you see this in prisoners shot. The thing you have to remember is that within 48 hours he's accused, but he's not convicted. He might not have been the one. Remember, they arrested him in Oak Cliff, and he was suspected as being the accused assassin, and he was charged, but he had not been convicted. So, you know, you don't know what the outcome's going to be. So you really can't take that in consideration.
This comes from somebody who clearly is up to date on the assassination. Why are the House Select Committee exhibits? Why is House Select Committee exhibit F-66 not reflective of your view of brain injury?
I don't know.
I'm not quite sure I understand that.
Yeah, it might be. Perhaps the questioner, because I'm not familiar with Exhibit F-66, and perhaps we'll give them an opportunity. There you go, right there. Why is that? Okay, so the question is, why is that not reflective of your conclusions? In other words, that shot front to back. That's higher than the one that you've talked about, Dr. McClellan.
Yeah,
why is that not reflective of?
It doesn't.
Too high.
The wound I saw was much lower in the back of the head than that. And I looked into that wound for some period of time, you know, from a distance of 16 or 18 inches.
You're both asked to talk a little bit about the roles of doctors Kemp Clark and can't read the
Dr. Grossman?
No, Dr. Grossman. No, this is Ford.
Ford?
I thought I had the world's worst handwriting. But
yeah.
Well, the fascinating thing is, it comes from a doctor. But if you can talk about Kemp Clark.
Kemp Clark was chief of neurosurgery, and Dr. Williams trained under him. He came into the ER, trauma room 1, a little later, but did go up to the head of the table and looked at the wound. And when we just talked about opening the chest, because closed chest massage had just been described just a very short time before this, and was not as common as opening the chest and doing a cardiac massage. So we just questioned that. Would it be worth it? And he was looking at the wound and gave us the signal, don't do that. So he was chief of neurosurgery. He's the one who made the official pronouncement of death and signed the death certificate, as I recall. And I don't know who Ford, if that's what.
Yeah. I'll work on that a little bit more. It looks like Ford. Here's a question I'm always curious about. What are the discrepancies between? Well, let me back up. While the two of you may have some disagreement about the wounds that you saw, is it fair to say that you both believe a better autopsy could have been done in Bethesda for the President of the United States? Better records done of that?
Here.
I'm talking about in Bethesda. Could better work have finally been done with regard to that? Better records have been kept? Because I keep hearing, reading reports that there's some concern about what was arrived at there as opposed to what you actually saw. Based upon what I'm seeing from people here, folks trust you. They trust the two of you. I'm not so sure that that's a shared opinion.
They had some disadvantage by not being able to see this neck wound because a cut had been made through that, so they didn't appreciate that. They did find the one in the back that we didn't find, and they could have perhaps examined the organs a little more closely. People have talked about the adrenal gland. Did he have Addison's disease? But the major injuries they described appropriately. They had a lot of measurements. They described this wound in a recent well, it's not too recent now, but in an AMA article, Commander Hume said that when he made the incision, and that's what you do in an autopsy to look at the brain, you make an incision, pull the skin forward, that the skull actually fell out in his hands. And when I first saw the president, when you looked at him, I thought he didn't look right on the table when I first saw him. His face looked relaxed. It wasn't full like it ought to be. And I think it was the brain, all the skull fracture that caused the skin to relax. But I don't know that there's much more that they would have found by further examination. Do you?
No. I don't think it would have made any difference.
Let me ask you both the final question. The people who aren't born yet, not with us today yet, what's the legacy that you want to leave to them with regard to your memories of what happened? How do you want your memories to be to those individuals in the future?
Well, I think you'd describe what you saw, and I think what you'd like to do is tell them what your participation in it was. And we can theorize a lot, and that's okay, but I think the bottom line is, what did you really do? Mm-hmm. What was the procedures that you performed on this individual? And what did you do with Oswald? That you participated.
I agree with that. I think all we can say is what we did and what we saw. And if we get off into theorizing about different things, I guess anyone could do that. But we're no better qualified to do that than anybody else, or maybe not as qualified as some people. So all we can do is say what we did and what we saw on those 2 days. That's the limited. And I hope people will think that maybe we functioned reasonably well under the circumstances.
Let's give our guests a round of applause.